Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dhiman Bhattacharya, Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature, Center for Comparative Literature, Bhasha Bhavan, Vishwabharati. The author of this particular module is Dr. Shagota Bhattacharya. This course is on Canadian literature and the module we are dealing with is prose writing in Canada with special emphasis on the writers who have immigrated from various parts of the world. As far as the learning objectives of these modules are concerned, they are: what do we understand by diaspora writings? Who are the major contributors in the field of prose writing in Canada? Identifying writers of diaspora origin who are writing short stories and novels. Understanding the basic thematics of the creative productions of these writers. What are the basic trends as reflected in the prose writings with special reference to short stories in this module? Shani Mootoo was born in 1957 in Dublin, Ireland, and grew up in Trinidad in a family of mixed Indian and Nepalese origins. After coming to Canada in 1977, Mootoo studied at the University of Western Ontario, where she received a BFA in 1980. She was an accomplished multimedia and experimental video artist before she took up writing. Having been told by her grandmother not to repeat that an uncle had abused her sexually, Mootoo adopted the visual mode of expression early in life as the primary means of articulating her innermost thoughts. Her visual works, videos, photographs and paintings have been exhibited and screened nationally as well as internationally. Her works include Out on Main Street 1993, Ceres Blooms at Night 1996, The Predicament of Ore 2000, He Drowned She in the Sea 2005, and Valmiki's Daughter 2008. Mootoo is a contributor to CBC's radio show This Morning and has been a writer in residence at a number of universities including University of Alberta. She currently resides in Edmonton and calls herself a Canadian writer. Out on Main Street. The narrator of the story, who is affectionately called Pudding or Pud by her girlfriend, and her girlfriend Janet are descendants of Indians who had once migrated to the Caribbean islands. After the second migration from the Caribbean to Canada, their families had settled down in Canada as double migrants. Pudding and Janet find themselves misfits and uncomfortable in the main street of Canada. The story is set in Vancouver, where they often go out for trips. On one such occasion, Janet and Pudding go to Kush Valley Sweets to taste Indian sweets. Pudding points to one piece of sweet and asks the shop attendant to hand her one piece, a mithai. The attendant laughs at her for not being able to identify that as kurma. He asks her about her origin and laughs at her inability to identify herself as an Indian. The experience leads Pudding to confirm that both Janet and herself are cultural bastards. After they settle down to eat, two intruders suddenly burst into the restaurant and start misbehaving with the waiters. They make racist comments and the other Indian women enjoying their afternoon snacks at the restaurant at that moment sympathize with the shop attendant and his brothers. Several of them move over to the counter and start talking with the shop attendants as if to express their support. The next moment, the restaurant door again opens and a bevy of good-looking Indian women enters the room. At once, the waiter shifts their attention from the middle-aged, sympathizing women to these young ones. One of them, however, goes to the extent of putting his hand behind the back of one of the older women and tries to be overtly friendly with her. This gesture was not at all well accepted by the old women, and she addressed Pudding about having to tolerate such behavior in public. Finally, the entire atmosphere of the place changed with the entry of yet another couple, Sandy and Lise. As soon as they spotted Jane and Pudding, they greeted them with such warmth and frankness that those who had not been able to recognize Jane and Pudding as a couple for so long now got to understand everything. As a result, when they were leaving the restaurant, Pudding turned to acknowledge the old women and instead got the feeling that her exit was more welcome. Racial identity in Out on Main Street. One of the prime concerns of this short story is racial identity. Janet and Pudding are originally Indians, but find themselves alienated from other Indians because of a significant historical incident which has taken place generations ago. Their grandparents had migrated to the Caribbean islands from India almost 160 years ago. They had tried to maintain their culture and heritage in their adopted homelands, but had failed to inculcate those practices into the succeeding generations. Most families of Indian origin in the Caribbean islands had been converted to Presbyterians and consequently had drifted apart from their original culture and religion. In the story, Janet belonged to one such Presbyterian family. Her Christian name and anglicized behavior did little to let her know about the origin and culture. In Canada, both Pudding and Janet found themselves watered down Indians. When they come face to face with real Indians, they are made to feel as the other. Their only problem is their skin color, by virtue of which they are mistaken as Indians. And that was the only reason why the old woman in the shop spoke to Pudding. The incident of the two drunk men entered the shop and abusing the waiters demonstrate that the shop owner, who is from Fiji, has to encounter racism in multicultural Vancouver. When the whites discriminated against the colored men, the brown women were by their side. But in a span of a few lines, it is seen that his solidarity is too temporary. Cultural identity in Out on Main Street. In this story, Indians from the Caribbean islands are shown as subaltern diasporic communities, as opposed to the NRIs. Unlike the NRIs, who are much feted, these Indians are most ignored. Authentic Indians are unlikely to see such Indians as Indians. They are more likely to see their discontinuity with India and cultural similarity with Creole. In Trinidad, Pudding had identified her family as kitchen Indians, that is, those who cook Indian food at least once a day. She had prided herself on being a Hindu par excellence, with a more superior knowledge of Indian traditions and rituals than the Presbyterian Janet. However, in the streets of Vancouver, they both find themselves at a loss to express themselves. In the Canadian city, the Indians, who are by themselves a minority, need to have an other in order to bolster their own authenticity. The cultural superiority displayed by the authentic Indians vis-a-vis the Indo-Caribbeans reflects a regrettable Indian attitude where a false sense of superiority is adopted to assuage their own minority status. Gender relations in Out on Main Street. The story engages with questions of gender and sexuality and critiques homophobia, which is most dominant within the colored groups. Janet and Pudding are a lesbian couple who have become used to not being accepted in the mainstream society. Their relationship had been much talked about since their days in the Caribbean islands, and even in Canada, they have not been able to express themselves freely. Pudding feels, acts and behaves like a man with her crew-cut hair, gym boots and blue jeans tucked inside those boots. In her own words, she looks like a gender they forget to classify. She feels jealous of anybody who tries to flirt with her girlfriend and becomes extra possessive and protective of her. Janet, on the other hand, is feminine with long hair, makeup, and high heeled shoes. Her sexual preference also changes as Pudding recalls that Janet had had physical relations with a man. Their adventures on the main street, particularly in the Indian shops, are under a garb of simple friendship. They refrain from showing any affection towards each other in public. However, the arrival of Sandy and Lizzie let the cat out of the bag as it left nothing to the imagination for even elderly Indian women. It was clear that after such exposure, Jane and Pudding had no other option but to leave the restaurant. The homophobic Indians were surely intolerant of such relationships. Language in Out on Main Street. In this story, the author problematizes power hierarchy in terms of both culture and language. The diasporic sensibility of displacement lends to her language a strange hybridity that can be defined as a translation of the thought processes of a confused mind. This confusion is further heightened because of altered notions of sexuality. Standard language is unable to express the condition of her characters who deviate from the norm. Feminist critics like Juliette Michel have argued that since the language at the disposal of a female writer is essentially patriarchal, and since she has to express female experiences in a patriarchal language, a woman writer's voice is bound to be fragmented. Mootoo goes one step beyond with her fragmented language, since her female voice refuses to comply with norms of female sexuality. The appropriation of lesbian and bisexual voices within the patriarchal discourse of writing essentially involves an automatic translation of the voices and experiences which cannot be expressed in any single standard language. The language of this story is a new literary decolonized space that allows accommodation to the dislocated and the fractured. It is technically known as patois, a substandard French. Since Janet and Pudding face social ostracization every moment in their lives, their expressions cannot be in socially rooted conventional languages. Hence, in Out on Main Street, English, French, patois all present themselves in inappropriate forms. As we are discussing short stories under prose writings in Canada, it is very interesting to note that how the various diasporas negotiate with the prose writing in Canada. In the case of Shani Mootoo, we will notice that she is actually trying to create a space of her own in her prose fiction. Starting from the language she adopts to the characterization, each and everything is well formulated to capture her experience as a person who migrated to this Canada as a visual minority. Next we move to Makeda Selvera. Makeda Selvera was born in 1955 in Kingston, Jamaica in a working class family. She moved to Canada with her parents when she was 13. She began writing in the 1970s as a reporter and freelance journalist. Her journalism and community activism made her aware of the problems facing Caribbean-born domestic workers in Canada. The result was Silenced, 1983. Silvera's first book. She is the co-founder and publisher of Sister Vision Press, a Toronto house that publishes writings by women of color. Makeda's collection of short stories include Remembering G, 1991, and Her Head, A Village, 1994. She has written novels such as The Heart Does Not Bend, 2003, and edited anthologies like Piece of My Heart, a lesbian of color anthology, 1991. The Other Women of Color in Contemporary Canadian Literature, 1994, and Pearls of Passion, A Treasury of Lesbian Erotica, 1995. Canada Sweet Girl. Millie Maxwell, a resident of the Caribbean island, came to Toronto with her friend in search of a job. It was partly financial crisis and partly a spirit of adventure that prompted her to migrate in her initial days in Toronto. She did odd jobs and spent her free time with friends in restaurants and pubs. At that point of time, she felt that moving to Canada had been the wisest decisions of her life. After some time, she found herself a job at a Chinese restaurant and thought of settling down in Canada. After working for a few months, Millie entered into a relationship with the owner of the restaurant, Mr. Young. It was more of a necessity rather than love, and Millie soon found herself at ease with her present situation as a mistress to her employer. As a consequence, Millie became pregnant and gave birth to a son who never knew his father. Since Mr. Young paid her expenses, Millie was unable to detach herself from him. As her son grew up, he resembled his biological father so much that Mrs. Young was forced to find out the secret. She threatened Millie to leave her husband and eventually got her fired from the job. Millie found herself a new destination and started to earn her living as a domestic worker. However, she did not have any legal document and always lived in fear of being deported. Her fears, however, came true a few years later. On a paltry charge of playing loud music, the police one day entered her apartment and sought her papers. Her inability to produce legal documents drew their suspicion, and Millie was summoned to appear before the court for a hearing on her status. A shivering Millie appeared before the judge one cold morning and was ordered to leave Canada within 2 weeks. It did not matter that she had been staying in the country for 9 years, that she did not have any criminal records, that she had $10,000 in her bank, and that she had a Canadian born son. Her lawyer, who took money from her regularly, did little to fight her case. Her second appeal got denied and she was handed over an Air Canada ticket to Jamaica. After struggling for 9 years to make a foothold in Canada, Millie Maxwell's world was turned upside down in a single day when she was thrown out of the country without even being allowed to take her Canadian son with her. Issues in Canada Sweet Girl. Canada Sweet Girl addresses the issue of Canada's biased immigration policy vis-a-vis the colored immigrants. This story directly refers to the Foreign Domestic Movement Program (FDM), which was initiated by the Canadian government in 1981 to attract women from the third world countries. This program and its successor, the Live-in Caregiver Program (LCP), established terms from the recruitment of women in Canada under a system of temporary permits. Under the LCP, women from the developing countries were allowed to enter Canada for domestic work and child care in a Canadian citizen's home. They were told that after a point of time they shall have the opportunity to apply for landed immigration status. But this story shows that such a thing was mere fantasy. The caregivers had to spend their terms in Canada as illegal immigrants and were deported back to their original countries after a point of time. It is very interesting to note that, like Shani Mootoo, Makeda Selvera also had carved a niche in the world of prose fiction in Canada. Coming from a Caribbean family, Makeda also had a hard time to establish herself in the literary milieu of the Canadian prose fiction. It will be worth mentioning here that the prose fictions by Shani Mootoo and Makeda Selvera had created successfully a language of resistance. As discussed earlier, it's not only the Creole language, but a language to engage with their sexuality. The oppression faced as a woman of color and of a different sexual orientation compelled these writers to negotiate with the mainstream. Makeda Selvera again and again emphasized through her writings about the displacement, or rather the double displacement of these women of color, and how they were subjected to various forms of oppression. Their choice of being a lesbian can be seen as entering into a dialogue with the normative discourses of the Canadian society. We now move on to another established prose fiction writer in Canada of Indian origin, Rohinton Mistry. Rohinton Mistry was born in Bombay in 1952 in a Parsi family. He received his BSc in Maths and Economics from the University of Bombay before moving to Toronto in 1975. He worked for 10 years in a bank while studying English literature and philosophy at the University of Toronto. Mistry began writing full-time in 1983 after winning the university-sponsored Hart House Prize for each of his first 2 short stories. His first published book was a collection of short stories called Tales from Firozshah Bagh, 1987, Such a Long Journey, 1981, A Fine Balance, 1995, Family Matters, 2002, and Scream, 2008 are amongst his novels. Currently lives in Brampton, Ontario. The various issues in Swimming Lessons, a short story in his collection Tales from Firozshah Bagh. The issue of political violence and intolerance in Bombay has been addressed in the same manner as that of racial intolerance in Toronto. Just as the Shiv Sena discriminates against the non-Maharashtrians and treats them inhumanly, in Toronto the value of a non-white immigrant is nothing compared to a white one. As a Parsi, Kersey has encountered discrimination both in India and in Canada. His neighbors, the old man, the Portuguese woman, the Yugoslavian birth, are all as alienated as him, since none of them do actually belong to the mainstream. In fact, Kersey's sexual desires are also manifestations of his loneliness, his inability to assert himself anywhere. Kersey's constant urge to make himself acceptable finds expressions in the inclination to learn swimming. He had failed to learn the art in Bombay and had consoled himself by saying that it was too dirty a place to swim. But in Canada, where the water is fresh and pure, Kersey is still unable to make himself comfortable. It is a symbol of his failure. It is a symbol that he is actually a fish out of the water everywhere. Neither the Indian shores were his own, nor the Canadian ones could be his. His constant sense of insecurity gets manifested as he helplessly tries to keep himself afloat. Actually, Kersey's insecurity is as much on land as in water. He suffers from a crisis everywhere. The most significant issue addressed in Swimming Lessons is the subject matter of diasporic writers. Mistry had himself observed that when an immigrant begins to write, it is taken for granted that the writing will address racism. The fact that a person of color may not want to write about racism and multiculturalism is never taken into consideration. Through the character of Kersey's father, the author points out that there may be several reasons as to why diasporic writers choose not to speak about their current place of residence. The standard opinion was that white Canadians preferred to read not about themselves or their country, but about the other. It can also be that it takes some time to settle down in a new environment and write about the new experiences encountered. But overall, it is seen that nostalgic writings have a better market and are much more preferred by both people in Canada and back in India. Mistry's own stand vis-a-vis the reasons that prompt his own writings about the Parsi community in Bombay remains ambiguous. Before moving to Vassanji as one of the major writers of prose fiction, it would be really interesting to discuss about Rohinton Mistry's contribution vis-a-vis prose writing in Canada. As a short story writer, Rohinton Mistry came into fame with his collection of tales from Firozshah Bagh and the subsequent novels that he wrote, which hugely became popular in Canada as well as other parts of the world. The question that comes to our mind is, are these Canadian? Are these Indian experiences? People like Rohinton Mistry have continuously mentioned that it takes time for a person of diasporic origin settling in an alien land to actually absorb the essence of the new land and write about it. Hence, in the fictional works of Mistry, we encounter the politics and the histories of India which he left, and probably he was trying to equate the unrest in India with the unrest or the incompatibility of his own community in the land that they adopted, be it India or Canada. Now we move on to Vassanji. Moyez Hussain Vassanji was born in 1950. He was born in Nairobi, Kenya, and raised in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. He is the son of parents who were second and third generation Indians in Africa. In 1970, he moved to the US to study physics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. After obtaining his PhD in nuclear physics from the University of Pennsylvania, Vassanji moved to Canada to teach at the University of Toronto. After 10 years and 30 published papers in his field, Vassanji became a full-time writer since 1988. Primarily a novelist, his works include The Gunny Sack, 1989, No New Land, 1991, The Book of Secrets, 1994, Amrika, 1999, and The In-Between World of Vikram Lal, 2003. His only collection of short stories, Uhuru Streets, was published in 1992. Apart from fiction, Vassanji has edited A Meeting of Streams, South Asian Canadian Literature, 1985. He is also the founder and publisher of Tsar, Toronto South Asian Review. Refugee. Refugee is the story of Karim, a boy from Uhuru Street who aims to sneak into Canada as a refugee to make a fortune for himself and his family. It was not Karim himself who had the ambition of becoming a rich man or living a hugely successful life. It was his mother's dream which persuaded him to chuck his apparently comfortable life at Uhuru Street in Dar es Salaam and plunge into unfamiliar terrain. In a desperate urge to see his family happy, Karim eventually decides to take the plunge and finds himself at the Frankfurt airport, ignorant of what to do next. He had been instructed to repeat that he was a refugee, and he did so, chanting it like a prayer. The trick worked up to the point when his passport was stamped and handed out to him with an address to report to. He had only a phone number to which he could not connect and stood around the airport like an absolutely stupid person. Eventually, with the help of a helpful Indian and a German, Karim could contact the person he was looking for and landed in Beirut. The ordeal was enough for him and he was already desirous of going back into the safety of home. But Karim knew very well that he was standing in a point from which there was no return. As he sat vaguely under an alien sky in an alien place, 2 policemen picked him up and locked him in a police station. A terrified Karim was interrogated and later released. At last, with trepidation and curiosity, he walked into the address he was asked to contact at in Beirut. It was a house where a Nigerian man was playing the piano and a German woman was dancing. Among the rest seated, there was a Sri Lankan, his host, and an Indian. All of them appeared to be sophisticated enough and all of them had legal documents with them. The police officers who had accompanied Karim left the place satisfied, and as soon as they left, several other people rushed out of their hiding from the adjacent room. They were all illegal immigrants waiting to travel to Canada via Hamburg, and Karim was going to be a part of them. It was a sort of business for Anand, the Sri Lankan host, who took in refugees from all across the world, gave them shelters in Beirut for a short period of time, and directed them towards the proper route to enter Canada as a refugee. The fact that Canadians were unable to distinguish Africans from the Lebanese, or for that matter any third world country, from each other had encouraged the flux of illegal migrants from these countries as refugees. Hiromi Goto is a Japanese-Canadian editor, fiction writer, cultural critic, arts advocate and teacher of creative writing who was born in Japan in 1966. Goto migrated to Canada with her family at the age of 3. She used to live on the west coast of British Columbia before moving to Nanton, Alberta. She studied at the University of Calgary and is at present the writer-in-residence of Department of English and Film Studies at the University of Alberta. Basically a novelist, her famous works include Chorus of Mushrooms, 1995, and Kappa Child, 2001. She has also co-edited The Skin on Our Tongues, 1993. Stinky Girl. Hiromi Goto's Stinky Girl is a semi-autobiographical narrative in which a daughter is affectionately referred by her mother as Stinko. She knows fully well that her mother does not mean anything when she recalls her daughter by such a name. It only reminds her that in the outer world also she is referred to as a Stinky Girl. It makes her feel that when a child is born, it is wet and stinky in a literal sense, irrespective of race and color. But no one is called a stinky child at the moment of its birth. This adjective is a marker of racism and is used only as an abuse. Thus, when she was really wet and stinky in her mother's arms, she was adored and loved by all. However, when the same child grew up and went to school, she became a stinky child because of her racial inferiority in the eyes of the white people. Unable to pinpoint exactly when and how she came to be considered as stinky, the girl narrator keeps on wondering what makes her so different from the rest of the people around her. Racial discrimination in Stinky Girl. The sole and central issue which concerns this story is that of racism and racial discrimination as encountered by people of Japanese origin in Canada. The physical features, the yellow skin, the slit eyes, as well as the cultural differences of the Japanese have not been much welcomed in Canada as such. The resentment increased and reached a height post the Second World War and the Pearl Harbor bombing in 1942. Several writers of Japanese origin living in Canada have documented their torment during that period, and Goto has always been very vocal about the racial discrimination against the Japanese. We now move on to Suwanda Sugunasiri. Sugunasiri was born in 1936 in Tangala, Sri Lanka and migrated to Canada in 1967. A scholar from the University of Pennsylvania, Sugunasiri earned his PhD from the University of Toronto. His major works are in Sinhala. He is a co-founding editor of SAR, a classical dancer and stage actor. The Search for Meaning, 1980, was his first major work. Life Struggle, 1961 and Idiots, 1966 are among his other notable works. Fellow Travelers. Fellow Travelers is a first-person narrative where the narrator recounts a family incident revolving around Podihami, a hapless woman who worked as their servant. Podihami had been picked up from the streets and given shelter by the family in exchange of household work. But the poor woman could never get rid of her habit of wandering about in the streets and picking up food from here and there. One day, this resulted in a severe bout of diarrhea and she had to be hospitalized. The family was not rich enough and the expense over the treatment led to a dispute. Auntie Fair, the narrator's aunt, and her sister, the narrator's mother, fought between themselves over Podihami. While the mother was dead against spending money to treat Podihami, Auntie Fair did all she could to make Podihami recover fast. She went to the extent of nursing Podihami so much that she herself fell ill. Her last pennies had been spent on buying medicines for Podihami. In such a situation, Podihami started to show signs of recovery, and she gave the impression that she was now well enough to nurse Auntie Fair. In addition to working errands for the mother, Podihami nursed the aunt till she was hale and hearty. Being sure that both the sisters are quite well, Podihami died the day after having massaged the two women's bodies. After this incident, Auntie Fair, who had been staying with her sister over a period of time, decided to go back to live with her adopted son. Before leaving, she explained that she would not like to spend her last days like Podihami, unwanted and unattended. She has realized that when a very useful person fails to provide service, she is discarded and considered a burden. Taking a lesson from Podihami's last days, Auntie Fair left her sister and went away. Fellow Travelers is a work by a diasporic writer set in his homeland. The story has no direct connection whatsoever with Canada. It represents another aspect of diasporic writing, where the homeland of the writer and his cultures and customs become areas of interest for his adopted homeland. As we have seen across our discussions, that it is very interesting to note that how prose writing in Canada gradually developed amongst the writers of diasporic origin. Diaspora in itself is a contested term. People who have migrated from various parts of the South Asian region, Japan, China and other parts of the world negotiate with their identity formation in their own language, creating an own language of their own, creating characters and negotiating with the realities through those characters. Be it sexuality, be it racial discrimination, be it the lack of identity. All these traits have been explored in the South Asian writings of the prose writers from South Asian origin.